A stagecoach wheel struck a frozen rut and split with a crack like a rifle shot, pitching one passenger hard against the door as the horses reared in front of Montana Depot. Elias Mercer moved before anyone shouted. He caught the young woman by the forearm, just as she stumbled from a coach, one boot sliding beneath the wheel. She jerked free almost instantly, more offended by being helped than frightened by what had nearly happened. She was 30, sun-browned, red-brown hair escaping beneath a battered hat, wearing riding trousers and old boots instead of the traveling dress Elias had expected. A worn saddle came down after her. No trunk, no outbooks, no bridle things at all. Elias stood there with one hand inside his coat, touching the photograph he had carried nearly 60 miles from Mercer Ridge Ranch. Clara Whitmore was supposed to have fair hair, a gentle smile, and a blue traveling dress. The woman before him looked as though she could rope a steer before breakfast and argue with the devil before noon. She unfolded a creased paper, read the name written there, then looked up at him. "Mr. Mercer?" Elias nodded. Her eyes narrowed. "I think you bought the wrong bride." And that was the moment everything Elias had planned for his future began coming apart. If you had been standing on that depot platform in the late autumn of 1887, you might have expected anger. Elias had paid a matchmaking service in St. Louis, exchanged letters for months, prepared a room, and ridden through cold country believing he was about to meet the woman who would become his wife. Instead, he studied the stranger for several quiet seconds. Then the corner of his mouth moved. He held out his hand. "Elias Mercer, since you're already here, we might as well start with hello." Her name was Maggie Callahan, and she did not take his hand at first. She looked at it as though there might be a contract hidden in his palm. Finally, she shook once and let go. Inside the telegraph office, the clerk checked the shipping papers twice before his face turned pale. 2 files had been switched somewhere east. Maggie had been promised work on a Wyoming ranch as a housekeeper and general hand. Clara Whitmore, Elias's intended bride, had been placed on another westbound route. Nobody yet knew where. The next coach that could take Maggie toward Wyoming would not leave for 10 days. She counted the coins in her pocket without letting Elias see, but he saw anyway. Outside, the temperature was falling, and the depot clerk warned that the first heavy snow could close the road before the week was out. Maggie squared her shoulders. "I'll manage." Elias knew that tone. It was the sound of somebody who would rather freeze than owe a stranger anything. He lifted her saddle before she could stop him. "There's an empty room at my ranch." Maggie stared at him. "You don't know anything about me." Elias looked toward the gray road, leading home. "You don't know anything about me either. Seems fair." She hesitated, then reached for her saddle. Elias did not release it. Not yet. 10 days, Maggie told herself. But before those 10 days were over, a storm would come down from the mountains. 80 head of cattle would disappear into the snow, and the woman Elias had never intended to meet would become the one person he could not imagine losing. Maggie Callahan arrived at Mercer Ridge Ranch, expecting to endure 10 uncomfortable days. By the end of her first morning, Elias Mercer had already begun to suspect the mistake at the depot might be more complicated than anyone understood. The trouble started with breakfast. Maggie burned the biscuits badly enough that Elias finally carried the skillet outside. She stood beside the stove with flour on her sleeve, watching him scrape the blackened bottoms into a bucket. "The agency said you were a housekeeper." Maggie folded her arms. "The agency also sent me here as your bride. You planning to trust everything they wrote?" Elias looked at the biscuits, then at her. "Not anymore." A laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Maggie stared. Elias seemed almost surprised by the sound himself. An hour later, shouting came from a corral. One of Elias's ranch hands was trying to saddle a young bay gelding that had already thrown 2 men into the dirt. Maggie walked straight toward the fence. Elias caught her arm. "That horse bites." She looked at his hand until he released her. "So do I." She climbed through the rails, spoke softly to the gelding, let him smell her palm, then worked beside him instead of against him. 10 minutes later, she was sitting in the saddle. Elias leaned against the fence, saying nothing. The woman who could not make biscuits had just done what 3 experienced cowboys could not. That afternoon, she stopped beside a heifer separated from a herd. How long has she been standing like that? Elias followed Maggie's gaze. Since morning, maybe. Maggie crouched, studied the animal's breathing, then told him to bring her into the barn. By sundown, they had caught the sickness early enough to treat it. Elias finally asked, "How does a housekeeper know cattle?" Maggie wiped her hands on her trousers. Because if the application said Cowgirl, most ranchers would have thrown it in the stove. Something in her voice told him there was more behind that answer, but he did not press. Over the next several days, Maggie stopped behaving like a stranded guest. She repaired a broken fence beside Elias, helped bring cattle down from the higher pasture before the weather turned, and could read hoof marks in hard earth where Elias saw almost nothing. She never waited for permission to work. Elias never asked her to. At night, they ate simple meals near the iron stove, usually something Elias cooked himself. Maggie discovered that he spoke little, because he had little interest in filling silence merely to escape it. Elias discovered Maggie could fill the same silence without making it feel crowded. Small things changed first. One cold morning, Maggie found her coffee already poured and sitting near the warmest side of the stove. The next evening, she found her worn riding boots beside the door with fresh stitching where the leather had split. "You fixed these?" she asked. Elias kept eating his stew. Couldn't sleep? Maggie knew that was probably a lie. She also knew better than to thank him too warmly. The following morning, Elias found a loose hinge on his tack room door repaired. Neither mentioned that either. On the 6th night, Maggie sat across from him while sleet tapped against the kitchen window. What's Clara got that makes a man ride 60 miles to marry somebody he's never met? Elias turned his tin cup slowly between his hands. Her letters were kind. Maggie waited. That all? He looked around the room. The table built for more people than had ever used it. The second chair that had spent years empty. "I suppose I thought I needed somebody who could make this place into a home." Maggie's expression softened. "Maybe you're looking for the wrong thing." Elias raised his eyes. "Meaning?" She glanced toward the repaired boots, the coffee pot, the muddy coats hanging together near the door. "Nothing." She stood before he could ask again. Later that night, Elias went to the barn and found Maggie sitting on a bale of hay, oiling an old saddle with a care she gave to almost nothing else. The initials PC were stamped faintly into the leather. When he asked about them, Maggie's hand stopped. Her father, Patrick Callahan, had raised cattle in Kansas. Maggie had ridden beside him from the time she was small enough to need help reaching the stirrups. When he died, her older half-brother sold the ranch. He controlled the papers and the money, and he made certain Maggie understood what he thought her place was. She left Kansas with her father's saddle, his hunting knife, and whatever pride she could carry. "I promised myself nobody would ever own my life again," she said. "Then some fool in St. Louis puts my name on a bride contract." Elias did not tell her that her brother had been wrong. He did not promise he was different. He only leaned against the stall and said, "Then don't belong to anyone." Maggie looked up. Elias nodded toward the ranch beyond the barn walls. Belong somewhere. For once, Maggie Callahan had no answer. Near midnight, a horse began screaming in the north pasture. Elias was out of bed before the second cry. Maggie reached the porch almost beside him, already pulling on her coat. A ranch hand rode through the darkness and hauled his horse to a stop near the steps. The northern fence had been cut. Fresh tracks ran through the opening. Elias took the lantern from him. "How many missing?" The cowboy swallowed. "Near 80 head. Maggie looked toward the Black Ridge. Snow had begun falling harder, covering tracks almost as soon as they were made. The ranch hands wanted daylight before following anyone into that country. Maggie crouched near the broken fence and studied the churned ground beneath the fresh snow. She touched one hoof print, then another. "They're taking them toward the north ravine." Elias looked at the sky. "If we wait until morning," Maggie said, "you won't have anything left to find." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Elias turned toward the barn and reached for his coat. "Then we'd better ride." The first mile told Maggie the thieves knew cattle. They had not driven the herd straight north. They had angled west across hard ground, then turned toward the ravine where wind would sweep fresh snow over the tracks. Elias rode beside Maggie while two ranch hands followed behind. Within 20 minutes the snowfall thickened until the lantern tied beneath Elias's saddle horn became little more than a yellow blur. One of the men shouted that they ought to turn back. Elias looked at Maggie. She pointed toward a broken sage branch half buried in white. "They passed here." He did not ask whether she was certain. "Keep moving." They found the first steer near the mouth of the ravine, limping through deep snow. Then another appeared, 100 yards farther on, the darkness filled with the restless bawling of cattle. Maggie dismounted and pressed 2 fingers into the snow beside a hoofprint. Mixed among the cattle tracks were horses, at least 4. "They're pushing the herd through the narrow pass," she said. Elias understood immediately. Beyond that pass lay open country and several trails south. Once the thieves reached it, 80 cattle could disappear into other herds before anyone proved where they belonged. Elias ordered his men to circle east. Maggie swung back into the saddle. "I'll come with you." Elias shook his head. "No." Her expression hardened. He added, "You know these tracks better than any of us. You're with me." That was different. Maggie nodded. They rode into the ravine without speaking. Wind drove snow sideways between the rock walls. Somewhere ahead, a man shouted and cattle surged. Maggie saw 3 riders working the rear of the herd and another farther up the slope. She leaned toward Elias. "Don't chase the men. Turn the cattle." Elias studied the terrain. A narrow shelf climbed along the western wall. If they reached it, they could come above the herd and drive the leaders back downhill. It was dangerous ground in clear weather. Tonight, it was nearly blind. Elias started toward it. Maggie caught his sleeve. "That ledge is iced. So is everything else." He looked at her once. "Stay close." They climbed until the ravine fell away beneath them. Halfway up, gunfire cracked from below. Elias's horse lurched. Maggie heard the bullet strike rock. She drew a revolver, but Elias pushed the barrel down. "Too dark. You'll hit cattle or one of ours." Another shot came. Elias drove his horse forward instead. They reached the shelf above the herd, and Maggie began shouting, swinging her rope against her saddle. Elias joined her from the other side. The lead cattle hesitated. Then one turned. Another followed. Within seconds, the front of the herd began folding back on itself. A thief rode up from below. His horse collided with Elias's gelding on the icy shelf. The animal screamed and went sideways. "Elias!" Maggie saw him fall. His shoulder struck the rock first. Then his body disappeared over the edge. She threw herself from the saddle and crawled toward the drop. Elias had landed 15 feet below on a narrow shelf. One leg twisted beneath him. His horse had fallen farther and vanished into the storm. Maggie started down. "Don't!" Elias shouted. She froze. Below them, the cattle were turning. The thieves were losing control. If Maggie abandoned the ridge now, they might recover the herd and drive it out to the far end of the ravine. "Get the cattle home," Elias called. "I'm not leaving you. That's my herd." Maggie stared at him through the snow. Elias gripped the rock beside him, pain tightening his face. "And right now you're the only one who can save it." For most of her life, men had told Maggie what she could not do. Elias Mercer had just trusted her with everything he owned. She climbed back onto her horse. Maggie rode the shelf alone, shouting until her throat burned. She drove the leaders downhill while Elias's 2 ranch hands closed the eastern side. The thieves tried twice to break the herd north, but their advantage was gone. One fired into the air. Another cursed and wheeled his horse away. Within minutes, all 4 riders disappeared to the snow rather than risk being trapped between the cattle and the narrowing ravine. Maggie did not follow them. She turned back for Elias. By the time she reached the ledge, snow had nearly covered his tracks. She slid down on her hands and knees and found him conscious but shaking violently. His left leg would not take weight. "Cattle?" he asked, turning home. A faint smile crossed his face. "Knew you could do it. Save your breath." Maggie got his arm over her shoulder. It took nearly half an hour to drag him back to the upper trail. Her mare fought them when Maggie tried to lift Elias into saddle. Twice he nearly collapsed. The third time Maggie cursed him. The horse, Montana, St. Louis, and every matchmaking clerk east of the Mississippi. Elias managed a weak laugh. "Something funny? I was supposed to marry a quiet woman. Keep talking, and you won't live long enough to marry anybody." The ranch was too far. The storm had erased the trail behind them, and Elias was losing strength. Maggie remembered seeing an abandoned line cabin on their ride out. She found it by following the slope south until a dark roof appeared through the snow. Inside were a stone fireplace, a broken stool, and enough dry wood beneath the bunk to start a small fire. Maggie lowered Elias against the wall and cut his trouser leg open at the knee. Nothing appeared broken through the skin, but the swelling was already severe. She wrapped the leg tightly, covered him with both their blankets, then sat beside the fire listening to the storm hammer the cabin. Hours passed. Elias stopped shivering. That frightened her more than the shivering had. Maggie moved beside him and pressed a hand against his face. "Elias!" No answer. She rubbed warmth back into his hands and fed the fire until the cabin became almost unbearable. Finally, Elias breathed deeper. Maggie sat back. Her hands were trembling now. "You stupid man," she whispered. "I wasn't supposed to care about you." His eyes opened slightly. "That's unfortunate." Maggie went still. "You were awake?" "Enough." She looked away, embarrassed and angry at herself. "Forget what you heard." "Can't." "Elias." "Because I think I started caring first." The storm seemed suddenly farther away. Maggie stared at the man she had been sent to by mistake. She could have laughed. She could have told him fever was making him foolish. Instead, she reached down and pulled the blanket higher, across his chest. "You're injured," she said quietly. "We'll discuss your bad judgment when you can stand." His eyes closed again, but the faint smile remained. By morning the storm had weakened. The ranch hands found them before noon, and the recovered cattle were already moving back toward Mercer Ridge. For the next 2 days, Elias rested with his injured leg propped near the stove, while Maggie ran much of the ranch without being asked. She checked the herd, assigned fence repairs, and rode the northern boundary looking for signs that the thieves might return. Elias watched her come through the door each evening with snow on her coat, and realized something he had been too cautious to name. The house had not become a home because someone cooked well or wore a dress. It had become one because he had begun waiting for Maggie to walk to the door. On the third afternoon, a rider from town arrived carrying a telegram. Maggie took it because Elias was still using a crutch. She tore the envelope open beside the kitchen table. Her face changed before she finished reading. Elias knew. "What is it?" Maggie folded the telegram carefully. They found Clara Whitmore. Neither spoke. "She arrives tomorrow afternoon," Maggie said. The silence that followed was different from every silence they had shared before. Maggie walked upstairs and closed the bedroom door. When she came down an hour later, her few possessions were packed. Her father's saddle was already waiting by the porch. Maggie was gone before sunrise. Elias discovered it when he came downstairs on his crutch and found the coffee pot still warm but her cup missing from the table. Her blanket had been folded. The repaired tackroom hinge stood quiet in the morning light. Outside, the place where her saddle had rested beside the porch was empty. One of the ranch hands said she had ridden south before dawn. Elias did not curse. He did not call for another horse. He simply stood there too long. By noon, his injured leg was swollen again, but he saddled his gelding anyway. "You ought not ride," one of the men warned. Elias tightened the cinch. "I'm going to town." Nobody asked why. The station platform was crowded when Clara Whitmore's coach arrived. Elias recognized her immediately from a photograph. Fair hair, blue traveling dress, calm face, everything the letters had promised. But Clara was not alone. A tall man stepped down behind her and offered his hand. She took it without hesitation. Clara saw Elias and stopped. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yes, ma'am." She looked embarrassed enough that Elias almost felt sorry for her before she spoke. "There's something I need to explain." The man beside her removed his hat. His name was Thomas Hale. He had been traveling toward Wyoming after receiving papers connected to the same agency. Somewhere east of Montana, the confusion had become stranger than anyone realized. Clara had been placed on Thomas's route. They had spent days traveling together, then several more waiting while officials tried to untangle the mistake. Clara looked at Thomas. The way she looked at him told Elias the rest before she said it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know what was arranged between us." But somewhere in all that confusion, she reached for Thomas's hand. "We found each other." Thomas looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Mercer, I never meant to take what belonged to another man." Elias stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Not loudly. "Just once." Clara blinked. "You're not angry?" Elias turned his eyes toward the southern road. "No." He thought about burned biscuits, a repaired hinge, snow packed into Maggie's hair, her hand against his face in the cabin. Then he said, "I think they made the same mistake twice." Clara's expression changed. She understood. "Where is she?" "Headed for Wyoming." Elias was already turning toward his horse. Clara called after him, "Mr. Mercer." He stopped. She smiled. "You may want to hurry." Elias rode out of town harder than his leg had any business allowing. Every mile sent pain up through his knee. He ignored it. Maggie had several hours on him, but he knew how she traveled now. She would avoid the main stage road whenever possible. She would water her horse before she watered herself. She would choose a crossing where the banks were shallow and the grass still showed through the frost. He found her track south of town. By mid-afternoon, the sky had cleared enough for sunlight to break across the hills. Elias followed the tracks toward a narrow stream bordered by cottonwoods. He saw her horse first. Then Maggie. She was kneeling beside the water, filling a canteen. Elias slowed. Maggie heard the hoofbeats and turned. For half a second, relief crossed her face. Then she buried it. She stood. "You're supposed to be meeting your bride." "I did." Maggie tightened the cap on the canteen. "That was quick." "She came with Thomas Hale." Maggie looked at him. "The Wyoming ranch man?" "Seems so." A short silence. Maggie gave a humorless laugh. "Well, good for them." She tied the canteen to her saddle. Elias dismounted awkwardly. Maggie noticed his limp immediately. "You rode that leg out here?" "Yes." "That's foolish." "I've been told." She turned away. Elias took one step toward her. "Maggie." She stopped. He had imagined a dozen things he might say. None of them seemed right now. Maggie looked back. "Did you forget something?" Elias did not answer. Instead, he held out his hand, the same way he had on the depot platform. "Open." Waiting. Maggie stared at it. Something in her face began to break. "Elias." He said nothing. She looked at his hand again. I'm still the wrong bride. His mouth lifted slightly. Then maybe I was waiting for the wrong woman. Maggie's eyes shone, but she looked away before the tears could fall. You don't owe me anything because I help with your cattle. I know. You don't owe me because I stayed in that cabin. I know. And I'm not going back because Clara chose somebody else. I know that too. She faced him again. Then why are you here? Elias lowered his hand for a moment, because this mattered too much for him to hide behind quietness now. I spent years thinking I needed a wife. Maggie flinched almost imperceptibly. Elias continued. Somebody to cook, keep house, fill the chair across from mine. Maggie folded her arms. Sound like Clara. It does. He looked at her. But then you showed up. She swallowed. My house got noisier. My horses behaved worse. My biscuit somehow got more dangerous. Despite herself, Maggie laughed with the tears gathering in her eyes. Elias stepped closer. And every evening, I started listening for you to come through that door. The laughter disappeared. Maggie looked down. Elias held his hand out again. I'm not asking you to be my bride. Her eyes lifted. I'm asking you to come home. Maggie stared at him as if the words hurt worse than anything he could have said. For years, home had meant something somebody else controlled. Her father's ranch had belonged to the men who signed the papers. Her future had belonged to an agency clerk who lied about what work she could do. Even the journey west had been decided by a name placed on the wrong document. Now Elias was offering something different. Not ownership. Not obligation. A place. And a choice. Her voice shook. You could have asked me to stay yesterday. I almost did. Why didn't you? Because I thought if I asked then, you'd always wonder whether I chose you only because Clara was lost. Maggie's face crumpled. Elias nodded back toward town. I met Clara. He looked at Maggie. Now I know exactly who I'm choosing. A tear finally slipped down Maggie's cheek. She wiped it away angrily. Just so we're clear. Elias waited. I'm still not good at being a wife. Good. Maggie frowned. Elias smiled. I wasn't looking for one anymore. His hand remained between them. I was looking for you. For a long moment, Maggie did not move. Then slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his. Elias did not pull. He let her close the distance herself. Maggie stepped toward him. Her fingers tightened around his. You make a terrible marriage bargain, Mercer. So I'm learning. You'll be eating my cooking. I survived the cattle thieves. That isn't the same thing. No, ma'am. Maggie laughed again. This time she did not hide the tears. Elias looked toward her saddled horse. Wyoming's still there if you want it. Maggie studied him. You let me go? His answer came without hesitation. Yes. That was the final thing she needed to hear. She stepped closer until her forehead rested briefly against his chest. I hate you a little for making it the right answer. Elias placed one hand carefully against her back. I can live with that. Maggie stayed there another moment. Then she lifted her head. Take me home. They rode back toward Mercer Ridge side by side. No contract waited for them. No agency had arranged what came next. And for the first time since Maggie Callahan had climbed onto that mistaken stagecoach, the road beneath her horse was one she had chosen for herself. A year later, the old wooden sign at the entrance to Mercer Ridge Ranch came down. Elias stood on a ladder, while Maggie watched from horseback, one hand resting on the saddle horn that had belonged to her father. The new sign was heavier, carved from dark pine and burned deep enough to survive Montana winters. Elias lowered it into place, while two ranch hands steadied the posts. Mercer and Callahan Ranch. Maggie read the words twice. "You put my name first on the cattle ledger, too," she said. Elias climbed down carefully. His injured leg still bothered him when the weather turned. "Half the cattle are yours." "More than half, if you keep letting me do the buying." "Then I'd better start paying attention." Maggie smiled, but something inside her remained cautious. She had come home with Elias that afternoon by the creek. Yet for months afterward she still kept her father's saddle packed, as though she might need to leave quickly. Her small traveling bag remained beneath the bed. Every time an unfamiliar rider approached the ranch, she glanced toward the door before she realized she was doing it. Some fear survived even after the danger that created them was gone. Elias noticed. He never mentioned the bag. He never asked when she would unpack it. He simply continued leaving coffee beside the stove each morning, asking her opinion before buying cattle, and handing her ranch papers before he signed them. One evening, he brought a deed from town and placed it on the kitchen table. Maggie read the first line. Her name was there beside his. "What's this?" "The ranch." "I can see that." "Then why ask?" She looked at him sharply. "Elias." He pulled out the chair across from her. "The land office recorded it today. Equal ownership." Maggie stared at the paper. Her brother had once used papers to prove she owned nothing. Now Elias had used one to make certain nobody could ever say that again. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did." "No, you didn't." Elias considered that. Then he nodded. "You're right." Maggie waited. "I wanted to." Her eyes filled before she could stop them. Elias did not touch her. He had learned that sometimes the kindest thing he could offer Maggie was room. She reached across the table and took his hand herself. 3 months later, they were married in the south pasture beneath a cottonwood tree. There was no grand church ceremony, no matchmaking agent, no contract promising what kind of wife Maggie would become. The ranch hands stood in their cleanest shirts. Clara and Thomas sent a letter wishing them well. Maggie wore a simple cream dress for the ceremony, then changed back into riding clothes before supper, because one of the Maras decided that was the perfect evening to foal. Elias followed her into the barn, wearing his wedding coat. Maggie looked at him over her shoulder. "You know most brides don't spend their wedding night pulling a foal into the world." Elias rolled up his sleeves. "Most brides aren't you." That spring, the ranch prospered. Maggie expanded the breeding herd and negotiated cattle prices so aggressively that 2 buyers from Helena began asking whether they could speak to Elias instead. His answer was always the same. "You can, but she's the one who decides." Slowly, the packed traveling bag beneath the bed gathered dust. One morning, Elias noticed it was gone. He found Maggie's clothes folded into the dresser instead. He said nothing. Neither did she. Some promises did not need to be spoken. Near the end of summer, a neighbor rode over and stopped beside the new ranch sign. He looked from the words Mercer and Callahan to Maggie galloping across the pasture after a loose yearling. Then he shook his head. "Still can't believe they sent you the wrong bride." Elias leaned against the fence. Out in the field, Maggie swung her rope once above her head and dropped it neatly over the yearling. She turned in the saddle and saw Elias watching. Even from that distance, she smiled. Elias remembered the woman stepping from a stagecoach with an old saddle instead of a bridal trunk. He remembered her looking at his name on a piece of paper and telling him there had been a mistake. He remembered holding out his hand, and later, beside a creek, holding it out again. "They didn't send me the wrong bride," Elias said. The neighbor frowned. No. Elias watched Maggie ride toward home. No. He smiled. They just put the wrong name on the paper. And perhaps that was the truth of it. A mistake had brought Maggie Callahan to Montana. But a mistake had not made her stay. She stayed because, for the first time in her life, the choice was hers. And if this story reminded you that love means more when the door is open and someone chooses to remain, write "She chose home" in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe for more stories from the American frontier, where sometimes the wrong road leads exactly where a heart was meant to go.